It started with what seemed like a blessing. The house came as an inheritance from my husband's grandmother, and although it was old and a bit run down, it was beautiful. Nestled at the edge of the forest, it stood tall and majestic, its age giving it a timeless charm. We moved in full of hope, eager to transform the house into a home. It was ours now, and we had big plans for it. The first few weeks went by smoothly. We began repairs, focusing on the main floor and bedrooms. Everything felt right. There was an eerie stillness to the place, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the isolation of the house, the fact that it had been empty for years. Nothing happened that would give us a reason to worry, at least not yet. But then we decided to renovate the attic. The attic was vast and filled with old, forgotten belongings, dusty boxes, broken furniture, and what seemed like generations of the family's life stored away. It hadn't been touched for decades. We thought it would be the perfect space for an additional room, maybe even an office or a guest bedroom. As soon as we began clearing out the junk, though, something shifted in the house. It was subtle at first. The air in the attic felt heavier, colder. We would leave tools or boxes in one corner and come back the next day to find them moved. I thought it was just us being forgetful, or perhaps the wind slipping through the cracks of the old wooden beams. But it wasn't just the wind. The first night we worked late in the attic, we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the space above us, where no one should have been. At first, we thought it was animals, perhaps raccoons or stray cats, but the sound was too precise, too human. Then came the sighs, long, drawn-out sighs that echoed through the empty attic space, as if someone was standing just out of sight, watching us. One night, I woke up suddenly, my skin crawling. I didn't see anything, but I felt it, an overwhelming presence standing at the foot of our bed. The feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was as though someone or something was observing us with cold, calculating eyes. I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. We decided to move forward with the renovation, despite the strange occurrences. We bought the necessary materials and climbed back into the attic, determined to finish what we had started. But as soon as we began, the atmosphere in the house shifted again. It was as if the walls were closing in on us, suffocating us with their silence. Then it happened. My husband was standing on the ladder, working on the ceiling beams, when suddenly the ladder shifted, turned in an inexplicable way. He fell hard onto the floor, twisting his legs so badly that he couldn't walk for days. There was no logical explanation for how the ladder had moved. We hadn't touched it, and there was no wind strong enough to cause it to shift so violently. It was then that we realized something, or someone was trying to send us a message. After the accident, we began to wonder if we had disturbed something in the attic. I did some research and discovered an old Slavic belief in the Domovoy, a household spirit or guardian, often tied to the house's well-being. According to legend, the Domovoy protects the home, but can become hostile if angered or disrespected. It made sense. We had invaded his domain, the attic, without asking for permission, without acknowledging his presence. The disturbances, the footsteps, the sighs, they were all warnings. He didn't want us there. We decided to stop the renovations. Instead of turning the attic into a new room, we would simply clean it up and leave it as it was. A gesture of respect, an unspoken agreement between us and the Domovoy. As soon as we stopped working, the disturbances ceased. No more footsteps, no more sighs, no more feelings of being watched. It was as though the house had returned to its natural state of balance. We didn't touch the attic after that. We left it alone, and in return, the Domovoy left us alone. 10 years passed, and the house became our home. We raised our children here, celebrated birthdays and holidays, and lived a peaceful life. The attic remained untouched, a silent reminder of the presence that lived above us. From time to time, I would hear faint noises from the attic at night, but I knew better than to investigate. I knew who, or what, was up there, and I respected the boundary we had set. One evening, my niece came to visit. She was curious about the house, especially the attic. I warned her not to go up there, but curiosity got the better of her. She climbed the stairs to the attic when we weren't paying attention. She came down pale and trembling. "There's someone up there," she whispered. "I saw him." She described a figure, a shadowy man standing in the corner, watching her silently. It was the Domovoy. He hadn't shown himself to us in all these years, but perhaps he wanted to remind us that he was still there, still watching over the house. After my niece's encounter, the noises returned. The footsteps, the sighs, the feeling of being watched. It all came back, stronger than before. It was as though the Domovoy was angry again, perhaps at the intrusion, or maybe because we had forgotten to honor him properly. We had no choice but to perform a small ritual, offering bread and milk in the attic as a sign of respect, asking for his forgiveness. Slowly, the disturbances faded once more. Years later, as we were cleaning the basement, we found an old trunk that had belonged to my husband's grandmother. Inside, we discovered a collection of letters, journals, and old photographs. One journal caught my eye. It detailed the grandmother's experiences with the Domovoy. She had known about him all along and had respected his presence, keeping the attic as his domain. She even mentioned that she would leave small gifts for him, tokens of gratitude to ensure the house remained peaceful. We realized then that we had neglected the traditions passed down by my husband's grandmother. We had disturbed the Domovoy, not just by attempting to renovate the attic, but by failing to continue the rituals she had performed to keep him content. We renewed the practice, leaving small offerings for the Domovoy, and ensuring that the attic remained his sanctuary point. One day, an old neighbor came by to visit. She had known my husband's grandmother and the history of the house. When we told her about our experiences, she wasn't surprised. She told us that the Domovoy had been with the family for generations, always tied to the house. "You're lucky," she said. "He's protective, but only if you respect him. If you don't, well, you've already seen what happens." Despite the peace we had restored, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Domovoy was still watching us closely. One night, I had a vivid dream. In it, the Domovoy appeared to me, standing in the attic, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't speak, but his presence was a warning. Never forget who truly owns this house. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. I knew then that we could never take the house for granted. Never forget the unseen force that kept it safe. Our children have grown up in this house, and they know the stories. One day, they will inherit the home, and they will inherit the responsibility of honoring the Domovoy. The house, after all, is more than just a building. It is a living entity with a spirit that demands respect. As long as we remember the lessons we've learned, the house will continue to be a place of safety and peace. But we will never forget the warning. This house is not truly ours, and we will never forget the presence that dwells within its walls. As the years passed, we maintained our silent agreement with the Domovoy. We never stepped foot in the attic unless it was to clean or leave offerings. Life went on peacefully, until one autumn day when my brother, Mark, came to visit. Mark had always been a skeptic, someone who scoffed at stories of spirits and superstitions. He considered the Domovoy nothing more than an old wives' tale, something to humor but not take seriously. When I told him about our experiences, he simply laughed. "You can't be serious," he said, shaking his head. "It's just an attic. There's no such thing as a house spirit." I warned him not to go up there, to respect the space, but he waved me off. "It's just a bunch of old boxes and dust. What harm can it do?" Before I could stop him, he climbed the creaky stairs up to the attic. From downstairs, I could hear Mark moving around, rummaging through the attic's contents. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, an uneasy sensation that I couldn't shake. This wasn't just any attic. I knew we had made a fragile peace with the Domovoy, and Mark's disrespect could easily shatter it. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by silence. "Mark!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I rushed upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the attic, I found Mark standing in the middle of the room, staring at something in the corner, something I couldn't see. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping closer. But before he could answer, the temperature in the room dropped. The air grew thick and suffocating, and that familiar feeling of being watched crept over me. This time, it wasn't just a presence, it was angry. Mark slowly backed away, his gaze never leaving that corner. "I think I saw something," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Without another word, we scrambled down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind us. My heart was racing, and I could see the fear in Mark's eyes. He didn't need to say anything. I knew he had disturbed the Domovoy, and now the spirit was furious. That night, the house came alive with sounds. Footsteps echoed through the hallways, but this time they were heavier, more purposeful. The walls seemed to creak and groan as if they were alive. Doors slammed shut on their own, and strange whispers filled the air, though we could never make out what they were saying. Mark slept in the guest room, but neither of us got any rest. I could hear him tossing and turning, occasionally muttering to himself about what he had seen in the attic. As for me, I felt the overwhelming sense that we were no longer alone in the house. Then, in the early hours of the morning, the worst happened. I heard a loud crash from the attic, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, stomping through the house. It wasn't just footsteps. It was as if the very foundation of the house was shaking. I ran into the hallway and saw Mark standing in the doorway of his room, his face ashen. "It's angry," he whispered. "It's coming for me." I knew there was only one way to make things right. We had to appease the Domovoy, to show respect and restore the balance we had disturbed. Without wasting any time, I gathered a few items that I knew would please the Domovoy: bread, milk, and a small wooden carving that had belonged to my husband's grandmother. Together, Mark and I climbed back up to the attic, our hands trembling as we carried the offerings. As soon as we stepped into the attic, the oppressive atmosphere hit us like a wave. It was colder than before, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. But we didn't hesitate. We placed the offerings in the center of the room, whispering apologies and asking for forgiveness. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still thick with tension, and I wondered if the Domovoy would accept our peace offering. Then, slowly, the temperature began to rise. The feeling of being watched faded, and the room returned to its usual, quiet stillness. We had done it. The Domovoy had accepted our apology, at least for now. The next morning, Mark packed his bags. He didn't say much, but I could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. He had always been a skeptic, but after what had happened, he couldn't deny what he had experienced. "I'm sorry," he said quietly before leaving. "I should have listened to you." I nodded, knowing that there was nothing more to say. Mark left, and the house returned to its usual, peaceful state. But I knew that things had changed. The Domovoy had shown us just how powerful it could be, and I wasn't about to forget that lesson. A few days later, I received a letter from a distant relative of my husband's grandmother. She had heard about our experiences with the Domovoy and wanted to share something with me. Enclosed in the letter was an old photograph of the house, taken many years before we inherited it. In the photograph, I noticed something strange. Standing in the window of the attic was a shadowy figure. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the Domovoy had been watching over this house long before we arrived. Determined to ensure that the Domovoy remained appeased, I decided to perform a final ritual. I gathered all the necessary items: bread, salt, a candle, and a piece of cloth that had belonged to the grandmother. Following the instructions from the letter, I offered these items to the Domovoy in a solemn ceremony. As I lit the candle and placed it in the attic, I spoke aloud, acknowledging the Domovoy as the true guardian of the house. I promised to respect its presence and asked for its continued protection. Since that day, the house has remained peaceful. The strange occurrences have stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched has faded. I now know that the Domovoy isn't just a spirit, it's a guardian, one that watches over the house and protects those who live within it. But I also know that it demands respect. Any sign of disrespect, any attempt to ignore its presence, could bring about its wrath once again. We have learned to live with the Domovoy, to honor it as part of our home. As our children grow older, I've started to pass on the stories of the Domovoy to them. They need to understand that the house they live in has a history, and that it's their responsibility to continue the traditions that keep the Domovoy content. It's become a part of our family's legacy, just as it was for my husband's grandmother and her ancestors before her. Though the house remains quiet, I often think about the future. One day, we will pass it on to our children, and they will inherit not just the walls and floors, but the unseen presence that lives within. I hope they remember the lessons we've learned, that the Domovoy is a part of the house, and that without it, the house would be incomplete. We've found peace here, and we've made the house our home. But we'll never forget that this house has a life of its own, a life that watches, protects, and occasionally reminds us that we are not alone.